Thanks for tuning into this presentation. You're about to either watch a video or listen to audio recorded at the Grassroots Radio Conference in 2012 at the Independent Media Center in Urbana-Champaign. Please enjoy.
I'm Nan Rubin, and I am currently the chair of the board of the Prometheus Radio Project, among other things. I'm very proud of that. And those of you that may not be familiar, there's lots of opportunity to hear about Prometheus, but we're very involved in the organizing around low power radio, along with many of the other people that are here this weekend. But that's not what we're going to talk about specifically today. I built my first community radio station in Cincinnati, Ohio, WAIF. We went on the air in 1975 within a week of WORT, and I'll get into that in a minute. My second radio station that I built was KUVO in Denver, Colorado. All these stations are still on the air. KUVO went on the air in 1985. And I'm also a founder of the National Federation of Community Broadcasters way back when, a founder of AMARC, which is the International Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, and I've been a community media activist for many years, just so people have some idea of what my background is. There's some people who probably would quibble with that characterization, but I'd like to think that that's a positive thing. Sitting next to me here is Petri Dish, who founded the Prometheus Radio Project and is definitely the papa of low power radio. Betty Yu, who is with the Center for Media Justice, and in particular the coordinator for the Media Action Grassroots Network. And we're all going to talk a little bit about the history of community radio and community media. But before we start, I wanted to ask everyone here who is currently associated in one way or another with a community radio station, please stand up. Like at a station, not just as a producer, but at a broadcast station. All right. Wow. Great. Now, don't sit down. Don't sit down yet. If your station is less than 5 years old, sit down. All right, we got a couple people.
No.
Okay. If your station is less than 10 years old, then sit down. If your station is 20 years old, sit down. 30 years. Oh, we got some real old timers here. 40 years. All right, so where are you from?
Columbia, Missouri.
Give us your call letters.
Oh, KOPN.
KOPN. All right. KCSB, Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara. Okay, KCSB.
WSB, Stony Brook, Long Island.
Stony Brook, all right. Hey, Norm.
WMBR in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
All right.
This is our 51st year.
Okay.
WMUA in Amherst, Mass.
Don't just talk to me, talk to the group.
WMUA in Amherst, Massachusetts.
Amherst, Massachusetts. All right, we got one in the back.
WPRB in Princeton, New Jersey.
All right. Now, is there anybody here associated with KPFA? Come on, Michael, stand up. No? Nobody's here from KPFA? You know why I'm asking? KPFA is the granddaddy of community radio in the United States. They're more than 60 years old. Wow. I'm more than 60 years old. This radio station is about the same age as me. They went on the air in 1948. So part of what we're going to do here is just really kind of refresh your understanding of the fact that community radio, even though it's very exciting and very new, if you just signed on the air very recently, we actually have a long history. And we've been around for a long time, and we've had a tremendous influence on media in the United States, even though a lot of people may not acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge that ourselves, and we need to be very visible in promoting the importance and impact of community broadcasting. This is really something that we should be shouting from the rooftops. And public as we know, public broadcasting in the United States right now, if you think of public radio, public television in the more well-funded mode, is in crisis. It's in serious trouble. And community broadcasting is also in trouble, and hopefully we'll be able to spend some time talking about what we can do to strengthen our own activities and our own needs and mission within our cohort. But we're part of the larger public broadcasting movement. We need to be cognizant of that, and we're caught up with some of that as well. And I think we also need to be aware of some of the factors going on in the bigger field. Danielle had mentioned early that we want to have a caucus around the future of community radio, something that I'm going to hopefully help coordinate. So come and see me later, or let's get together later if you're interested in this. And it's going to be the impact that we're having, not just ourselves and what we can do to help ourselves, but what it also means for the whole system, because we are part of that big system, and what's going on nationally definitely has an impact on us, as well as us being able to have an impact on that. So, very briefly, I did want to talk about how community radio has evolved. There are 4 kind of major periods within community radio within the United States. The first one is the very early one, starting with KPFA, which was really an experimental station. KPFA is on the dial at 94.1. And if you know the radio dial, 94.1 is the commercial part of the FM band. And the reason that they're in the middle of the commercial part of the FM band is when they went to the FCC and asked for a license. First of all, most of the radio stations being licensed in the 40s were AM stations. FM was a trash portion of the band. People didn't have radios. They didn't have FM radios. It was not considered anything that people were ready to exploit commercially. And even though the FCC had put aside some small part of the spectrum for non-commercial use, which were mostly college and universities that were getting these experimental licenses for broadcasting, Pacifica Foundation was not an educational institution. So the FCC did not want to give them an educational license. They made an exception, and they gave them a non-commercial license, but they did not give them an FM frequency in the non-commercial band. They gave it to them in the commercial band because they were nervous about whether this was not really an educational institution. And I just mention that because there are other stations, there are non-commercial stations, not just in the non-commercial part of the band, particularly with LPFM now, but there are high-power, full-power stations across the band that are non-commercial in the commercial radio section of the broadcasting spectrum, and KPFA really started that. KPFA also started the concept of listener sponsorship. All of the pledge drives that you hear on public radio and TV started with Pacifica. And if you ever hear the Corporation for Public Broadcasting or any of those public radio stations or TV stations saying, we want to thank Lou Hill and Pacifica Radio for giving us the concept of listener sponsorship, let me know. I want to give those guys a gold medal, because public broadcasting chooses to ignore this legacy and what it has really meant to them. I think it's one of the real problems with the system. They have really tended to try to marginalize a lot of the work that we've done, even though it's transformed what it means to be a public broadcaster in the United States. So KPFA, first station on the air. That was followed by other Pacifica stations and a group of stations that went on the air very early in the late 60s that were started in part by Lorenzo Milam. Raise your hand if you know who Lorenzo Milam is. He was really the person, he wrote Sex and Broadcasting. He's really the person that brought the concept that you, a community group, can start your own radio station. He and his engineer and friend Jeremy Landsman, they started KRAB in Seattle. They helped to start KBOO in Portland. There were a whole group of stations. They actually started a commercial station in St. Louis, and they were very influential, not just in starting stations themselves, even though they did that, but because they wrote the handbook, Sex and Broadcasting. Here's the step-by-step guide to how you can start a radio station that's what I did. I got a copy of this little book. It said, oh, you can start a radio station. I said, gee, that sounds like something that would be fun to do on my summer vacation. Sex and broadcasting made it possible for people all around the country to start radio stations, and they did. So that was part of the second wave, major wave of stations. This was starting in the late 60s, but through particularly early 70s through beginning of the 90s. This was the Vietnam War period, the counterculture period. There was a tremendous amount of turmoil politically in the country. Geez, sounds familiar. People were very eager to have their own voice because they wanted an opposition to the Vietnam War. They wanted an opposition to conservative politics. They wanted to be able to talk about nuclear disarmament. They wanted to be able to talk about apartheid. They wanted to be able to talk about the war in Central America. There were a lot of things going on. And Lorenzo and Jeremy made it possible for people to learn how to do that, how to fill out an FCC application, how to organize in their community, how to get an application, how to plug in the equipment and turn on the transmitter. That really was a tremendous explosion of community licenses at that time. And we saw a lot of the people here, the stations that said they were on the air 40 years, that was a whole group of stations there, including the station I started, WAIF, we went on the air in '75, WORT, WRFG in Atlanta, WEFT right here, it's one of those stations, KBOO, what were the others? There were a couple of others. KOPN, right, Columbia, Missouri, that was one of the big ones. KPOO, yes, San Francisco. These stations, by and large, they're still all in the air. We do have a history. There are a few stations that have gone off the air, but in fact, the history of community radio, despite every political battle and turf war at every station, besides every problem that has come with fundraising, these stations stay on the air. Somehow people keep them on the air because that's how important they are. So we have this wave of stations, largely categorized in a very loose network called the Crab Nebula, K-R-A-B. That's because Crab, the station in Seattle that Lorenzo and Jeremy started, was one of the real leaders in the system. People really turned to that for what it meant to have community radio. It was a slightly different type of a model than Pacifica, but it was all really based on the Pacifica model. Another really important factor in this second wave of stations is that the National Federation of Community Broadcasters got started because there was a critical mass of stations. There were enough stations to be able to go to Washington right at the time when CPB was getting organized and when NPR was getting organized. Community radio had enough stations to go to Washington also and say, we are also here, we are also going to participate in the discussions about funding and in the discussions about policy around the public broadcasting spectrum. And one of the things that NFCB did that was very successful was to get a policy at the Commerce Department, which had money to give to broadcasters to build stations, to give you money to buy your own transmitter, which is expensive, and antenna. They had a program which was called the Public Telecommunications Facilities Program. It basically was dedicated funding just to buy hardware. NFCB was successful in the late 70s and early 80s getting that program to put a priority of funding for new stations for minority groups. This was a real radical change because before then, all of the money was going to colleges and universities. And what that meant was Native American tribes and groups working in Native communities, Latinos, and also the historically black colleges and universities all started getting stations. This was not only radical, but it was very different. And within the public broadcasting system and within public radio, those groups are now very prominent to our part of the dial. The Latino Public Broadcasting Consortium and Radio Bilingue, there are more than 36 stations that have predominantly Latino audiences as their target groups. There are now, I think, 45 Native American stations in a group where that are still going on the air. Mostly reservation-based, but not all owned by reservation groups. I mean, not owned by tribes. They're owned by groups on the reservation. They're on the air predominantly really rural areas and serving a relatively impoverished community, but a very, very important factor in their communities for cultural preservation, for economic development, for cultural expression, and also for youth organizing, and really for dealing with a lot of the social problems that are on the reservations. There's also a separate network of black public radio stations. They're predominantly based at historically black colleges and universities, not exclusively, but predominantly. These are groups that are part of our community broadcasting cohort. They're groups that NPR and CPB, I don't say they ignore them totally, but they've never really embraced them as part of the public radio community. They're part of our community, we're part of that community. This is a really important group. And many of those stations went on the air within the second wave because the funding was there for them to buy transmitters and antennas and studio equipment. The third wave really started at the end of the 90s, and I'm going to turn that over to Petrie because this is where low power shows up. Before that, the stations were all considered like full power. They would be like 100 watts or 1,000 watts or more. And we're talking about community radio stations that are 100,000 watts and some are even higher. KPFK in Los Angeles, which is a Pacifica station, was grandfathered in. They're a radio station that reaches the greater Southern California area. They have 110,000 watts. It's probably the most powerful community radio station in the country. So when you think about community radio, we don't want to be marginalized. We have a huge booming voice, even though some of them are very small. So I'm going to hand it over to Petrie to talk about the third wave of community radio and low power.
Great, thanks, Nan. So actually, I'm going to start a little earlier because actually not very far away from here, it was a town called Springfield. There was a family, the Contaco family, and Mbano Contaco was blinded by police brutality as a teenager. And it was an African-American family, and they were trying to organize a tenants' rights union for their housing project. And the first idea that came up was they said, well, why don't we make a little newsletter, like a little newspaper for people to like communicate and talk about the issues that we face. And Contaco, being blind, said, I won't do anything for the newspaper, but why don't we start a radio station? So from somewhere, I think from Canada, he bought this little 1-watt transmitter and he put it on the air and broadcast to his housing project for the next 3 years or so. And very little came of it except that inside the housing project it became like, the newspaper of this, the small group of citizens. And it went along that way without any trouble. It didn't have a radio license, it didn't have anything, but then there was an incident of police brutality right by the project where a guy got beat up by the police. Contaco went and interviewed him in the hospital, and within a day or so after people hearing that on the radio, there were demonstrations and riots in this tiny town in Illinois. And just about a week later, the FCC came, and the FCC said, you don't have a radio license, your transmitter is going to cause airplanes to fall out of the sky. We didn't notice it for the past 3 years, but a very serious problem here. And basically, Contaco just, he did something incredibly courageous, which was the next day he went downtown in front of the federal building. He turned his transmitter back on. He said, "Somebody arrest me! Somebody arrest me for speaking to my community." And it was kind of an embarrassment because the FCC hadn't caught him before. They didn't know what he was doing, and he said, "I don't think that it's because the airplanes are going to fall out of the sky. I think it's because something I said, and I think that I had a First Amendment right to say it." And so it was very embarrassing to the FCC, and they just never came back. And he kept on broadcasting and kept on running this station with his family out of his house. And people around the country started to hear the story. Well, wait a second, there's a pirate radio station that the FCC won't shut down? Why is that? And that was the inspiration for the low power FM movement. Then there was a guy in Berkeley, Stephen Dunifer, who very angry about the coverage by the mainstream media of the war against Iraq. He went up into the hills with a backpack and he started broadcasting without a license. And when he was fined $20,000, his lawyers went before the federal court. The federal court was trying to get the FCC was trying to get an injunction against Stephen Dunifer that would send him to jail for a year if he broadcasted again. And the lawyers said, well, yes, the FCC has the right to regulate the airwaves, but they are supposed to do so in the manner that is the least harmful to the First Amendment of the United States that's possible. And you can't tell me that Clear Channel owning 1,200 radio stations across the country and my client can't own any, that is the least restrictive set of regulations that you can come up with for regulating the airwaves. The judge was baffled. And what she did was she decided not to give an injunction against Stephen Dunifer. So even though he owes $20,000 to the FCC, he is not put in jail. And she says, in the meantime, while I decide this case, he can just keep on broadcasting. So he sets up a storefront. He starts selling kits and sending them around the country. And in the ensuing 4 years, about 1,000 pirate radio stations got on the air. The station that I was involved in Radio Mutiny in Philadelphia, was one of those, that wave. You know, we watched, they say that reasonable people don't change history. And it was really Mbana Kantako, who had no intention of being reasonable, who kind of forced the world to fit his vision of what should be, which is that, if you're a little community organization, that you can have a voice, that you can have a radio station that serves your interests and isn't part of the big universities and isn't part of the big corporations. So once there were 1,000 radio stations that were broadcasting around the country, the FCC had a moment where it had to kind of reconsider its approach to low power community broadcasting. And we had the great fortune that there happened to be at that time the first African-American chairman of the FCC, who mostly just did lots of things to help out corporations and mostly went around the world telling people that they should adopt the American style of broadcasting and that sort of thing. But something about, something about Mbana Kantako and the pirates and everything, plucked a chord in him somewhere. And he did, when the judge did finally rule in favor of the FCC and gave the authority to shut down all the pirate radio stations, the first thing Kennard did was he went around and he started shutting them down, and close to 500 raids over the course of the next year. But at the same time, he realized that he couldn't just do that without changing something. And so he pledged that during the time that he was the FCC chairman, he was going to change the laws and make it possible that small neighborhood organizations could get a radio station. He also was ordered by Congress to preside over a massive consolidation of media ownership, where we went from a system that mostly had a lot of local businesses owning radio stations to a system where you had these mega chains that had thousands of broadcasting stations around the country, and you had a massive decline in minority ownership. And so during the time that Kennard was chairman, he actually saw a decline in the minority ownership of broadcasting, which must have just been very, very ironic to him. So at first, when he said this, we thought that he was full of it. We thought he was just totally, blowing smoke up our ass, trying to get us off of his case. But what happened was, they shut down the station that I started, Radio Mutiny, and I didn't have anything better to do. So me and a couple friends, we started the Prometheus Radio Project with the boring job of trying to hold the FCC accountable to their promise of creating a community radio licensing scheme. And so we spent a couple years hiring engineers and hiring different, getting involved with lawyers, learning the way Washington works. And in 2000, the FCC passed the local community radio service. And there was suddenly an opportunity for a neighborhood organization to get a 100-watt radio license in their community. It was not everything that we had hoped for, but it was quite a step. And it allowed many hundreds of radio stations to go on the air across the country. Now, we thought we had won because we had convinced the FCC. The FCC had actually switched sides from persecuting these pirate radio stations to offering licenses for these low-power radio stations around the country. So we were really excited. We thought we had it made. But then we came to understand how power in Washington really works. And the FCC, which looked like the biggest thing, the most important giant institution that we possibly could have to fight, we fought them, we won. And then 6 months later, the Radio Broadcasting Preservation Act was passed by Congress. And what the Radio Broadcasting Preservation Act did was it actually took away the authority of the FCC to give away 100-watt radio licenses in urban areas. And so by changing the criteria and by saying that the FCC, which has like the best broadcast engineers in the country, did not know how to regulate the FM band, low power radio was like swept aside and only allowed in smaller towns. So like a town like Urbana, which has a radio, an LPFM, it's one of the biggest towns that actually gets a low power FM license. So all the stations that we thought that we would be building in, in Milwaukee and New York and Seattle, they were all swept aside. So for the next 10 years, that's what Prometheus did. We built small radio stations in small towns around the country, and we tried to build political support for what was called the Local Community Radio Act. And the Local Community Radio Act would be essentially a repeal of the Radio Broadcasting Preservation Act and would allow would basically allow New York or Washington or Seattle or New Orleans to have the same kind of radio license that Urbana, Illinois now has. And that was passed after a little bit of work in January of 2011. And what we have coming in the next year or so, sometime in the spring, there will be an opportunity for people to apply not just in Opelousas, Louisiana, but also in New Orleans, Louisiana, for community radio licenses. So that's kind of where low power radio was and is. I think it's important. I bring up Mbana Kantako, he's because it's important to realize that the origins of this movement, it wasn't so much about people that just wanted to do radio. It was people with a social justice mission that was being ignored by the existing corporate media. And it all started in a different time. I mean, back in the 1987, when he started, it was before there was a Google. It was before there was like all these sorts of things, and the ground has shifted somewhat. At that time, there was a small handful of corporations that were very insistent on having unique control over what went out electromagnetically over the airwaves and what influenced the way people thought about things. Now, there's all these new technologies through the internet where they want everyone to express themselves. They want everyone to say everything about themselves so that they can aggregate it and group it and manipulate it and make sure that they are recasting their marketing so that they capture all that information that you're putting out about yourself. So the paradigm has shifted a little bit. But what is important about community radio is that, first of all, it was an act of resistance that came out of social movements, that there were constraints on the way that people communicated. And it's a collective endeavor. And so, people think a lot about blogging. Oh, it's all these people that are in fuzzy slippers, on their sofa, expounding about whatever. But what community radio stations are is they're collaborative efforts where there's there's peer interaction, there's this connection to community, that keeps us honest, that keeps us like integrated into the lives of the people that we're working with. And so as we look forward, we have to think about some of the things that we thought of as the most terrible parts about community radio. Oh my God, all those meetings. Oh, we gotta sit around and everyone's arguing about this and that. The thing is, we know how to do that. We actually know how to collaborate, and we don't collaborate through like the way that Facebook wants us to collaborate. We actually collaborate in an organic, social movement built way. And so those are some of the things that we have to think about as our assets as we go forward into new technologies, into new barriers and limitations, new ways that we have to that we have to fight for the political power that we've always needed from media. So with that, I'll pass it back to that.
Give it to me for just a sec. Petrie, thank you. Petrie reminded me of one thing that I'm really glad he brought up, which is that our movement has really been built out of a real passion for the political mission and goals for social justice. And it reminded me that I wanted to mention, again, going all the way back to Pacifica, the name Pacifica Foundation really came from pacifist. Lou Hill was a pacifist, and Pacifica Radio was started not just as a project against commercial radio, but actually in response to the horror of the Second World War. This was actually a political movement right from the very start. So on that note, I think it's really appropriate for me to ask Betty, you to say a few words on, now we're in the fourth wave, which is our current state here, moving forward not just with low power, but with a lot of new collaborations, because our media landscape and our technology is so radically different than it's been over the last 50 and 60 years.
Well, I'm not sure if I can follow that. Two powerhouses up here, so it's a pleasure to be up here with you all. So my name is Betty Yu, and I'm with the Center for Media Justice, and I also coordinate the Media Action Grassroots Network. And I'll tell you about what we do in a second. I'm just going to sort of share a personal story of how I got involved in this work, and then talk about some of the organizing efforts now that CMJ is involved in around low power radio, and then some of the challenges and opportunities from our vantage point nationally around organizing in community media and community radio. So I actually got involved in this work, in social justice work, about 17 years ago when I was in high school. And I come from a working class immigrant community of garment workers. My mother's a garment worker, my dad's a garment worker, my grandmother. Just seeing firsthand what long hours and sweatshop conditions, garment conditions really can do to a family and to one person's soul. So just seeing how the toiling of long hours really impacted my parents in a real direct way. So I actually got involved with labor organizing in Chinatown, and it's actually one of the first worker centers that was started in this country, I guess 35 years ago. But I got involved, and I got my family involved in organizing to change these conditions in Chinatown, because people were getting paid less than the minimum wage. You know, even in union shops and non-union shops, there's labor law violations. And so what was happening in our communities, that we were seeing that even the ethnic media at that time, at least, the Chinese dailies, were really putting out really anti-worker perspectives. I mean, there was, because if you look at all the ads in the newspapers, they were all put out by restaurant owners, sweatshop owners. It was just sort of this big, what we call this sort of axis of evil. And so we realized early on that we needed to tell our own stories. We got a grant from the local public access TV station, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and we got a grant for equipment, analog equipment at that time, and we were able to, it was all self-taught, and so I was able to work with young immigrants, older immigrants, documented and undocumented, telling our stories. People brought their cameras back home to document their own lives and what it was like to live a life of a garment worker, but also to show, more importantly, to show that that Chinese immigrants are not passive. We don't like long work hours, despite what people are saying out there in the corporate media, in the mainstream media, even in the local media in Chinatown, but that people are actually organizing, and we actually were able to win some major, huge labor law wins, federal and state. And it was because actually public access television and our video programs played nationally. We won these awards for it. It was made by young people and older immigrants in the community working together. And actually the local community radio station, WBAI, was really, really integral in giving us the floor in so many ways, being right there with us and documenting a lot of the labor protest, pickets. There was a hunger strike at one point in front of a restaurant that was paying their workers 75 cents an hour. They were right there. They were always the first ones, like Manhattan Neighborhood Network and WBAI were like the first ones on the ground to really document what was happening. So I just kind of wanted to share that story because I think it's really relevant to how I got involved in this work. You know, I wasn't like a community radio head or a public access person in the very beginning. And then since then, I've actually worked at Manhattan Neighborhood Network for 8 years. I was in their community media department developing community partnerships. And then I was on the board of the Alliance for Community Media for a couple of years, and that's the national organization of over well now it's shrinking, but at one point, a couple years ago, 3,000 public educational and governmental access stations, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. And it really came from the work that I was doing as a labor organizing in Chinatown at the time. So anyway, so the Media Action Grassroots Network is a local-to-local advocacy network. We have about 140 organizations that are part of the network at this point, and they're all folks who are doing frontline organizing around issues like labor and immigration, housing, education, all the issues that we care about, you know. And I want to pause for a second just to scan the room to see who here like volunteers with or works with maybe a social justice or community-based organization. Just curious. Who doesn't? So practically everyone here. That's great. Who here actually, as a part of their job at the radio station, a big part of the job is building community partnerships or outreaching to community groups and that kind of thing? Oh, that is great. Because usually that's the first thing that gets cut, at least in the public access TV stations. That's always the first thing to get cut, especially now with the threats. So basically, we have our network. We have a combination of community-based organizations, social justice folks, and then media activists and content producers. But what binds us together is this belief that we need to stay vigilant on media policy issues that are happening in DC, whether it's city, state, and then especially FCC and on the federal level. Because what's happening, as we all know, since the public access fight in 05, the net neutrality fight, is that these cable companies, these telcos are passing these laws, and they think that they can just do it without anyone noticing, right under our noses. And so Magnet actually was started because there was this need for a grassroots voice to do grassroots mobilization. And there's all these other groups like Free Press and all these other groups that are doing amazing work in DC and fighting the good fight on the national level, right in DC, and in terms of the immediate legislative change. But we really felt like we needed long-term sustainability. So looking at looking at the community organizing model, leadership development, direct organizing, base building, that kind of thing. And so for us, it was a priority to work with people who are most directly affected by media injustice. And so we have 10 regions that we prioritize in the network, and one of them being obviously here, downstate Illinois in Urbana, whose IMC is the anchor for our chapter here. We work with folks in Albuquerque, New York, Philadelphia, woo! Albuquerque, yay! Minneapolis, Chicago, and you can go to magnet.org and you can find out about the regions that we work with. But mainly it's prioritizing folks who are directly impacted by social injustice and media injustice, communities of color, immigrant folks, rural and native folks. That's who we prioritize in terms of like pushing for media policy change. And our end goal, right, ultimately is ending racism and poverty. You know, for us, media is a means. Media transformation is just a means, as a pass-through, but that's not our end goal. We don't want it's not just access for anyone, right? And that's where I personally differ around public, whatever, access issues or free speech issues. It's like for who and for what? Like what is the ultimate end goal? But just briefly is that, you know, CMJ and Magnet we're part of a national organizing effort that Prometheus is in the leadership of, along with other partners. And there's an effort, as Petrie talked about, there's an effort to get hundreds of, and maybe thousands of organizations to apply for low-power radio stations. And so our priority regions for Magnet is Minneapolis, Albuquerque, Texas, and Milwaukee. And I really want to point out the Twin Cities model. So Twin Cities Community Radio, not far from here, 8 hours from here, has an amazing model because from the get-go, about 8 months ago, I would say, when they heard about this LPFM opportunity, they've been doing on-the-ground organizing. So the folks that are involved in the coalition is like Hope Community. They do work around with public housing residents. Main Street Project, they do a lot of organizing with rural folks in the Latino community and the migrant community. Little Earth, which works with the native population. So already the nature of the coalition, they're all folks who understand how media fits into their model. But what they've been doing to sustain interest is like training people how to tell their own stories through radio, and just by the nature of their work is just kind of embedding it in community organizing opportunities. So I know we're probably short on time, so I'm going to try to speed up. I would just, I want to kind of end off by talking about, I guess, opportunities or challenges and opportunities. I think the challenge for us, like you said, is that there's all these platforms for distributing our media. But I think key to that, even if we're talking about the internet, we're talking about radio or television, is that not just our survival, but it's fundamental that we position ourselves within the larger economic, social, and racial justice movement. And I think that's a fundamental belief and principle of Magnet and Center for Media Justice. And again, we talk about the issues in three ways. We talk about the issue around media justice as access, rights, and power. And so when we talk about access, we talk about not just receiving the content, right? Because there's all that corporate garbage out there, but we all know very well we can be passive consumers of garbage. But the access piece, of course, is creating our own media and content and distributing it. And that's really important, as we all know, when we are able to tell our own stories. And I just want to give a shout out to People's Production House. I don't know if they're here. I mean, I know Carlos and Abdullah is here. They're here somewhere.
I saw Carlos.
And they are an amazing organization if you don't know about them. They actually have an amazing model that I think should be lifted on a national level. They are actually in New York. They're our anchor in New York for our Magnet chapter. Oh, sorry, People's Production House.
They have a session about their model.
Right after this, right? Yeah, I think it's right after this. And just a little bit on People's Production House. They're in New York, but they started about 10 or 12 years ago. And folks who were radio people, but really involved in community organizing. And they teach radio to young folks, immigrant rights organizations, labor, folks who are working on housing rights. So some of the groups they work with is like Domestic Workers Union, Make the Road by Walking, which is an amazing group in all throughout New York City that does organizing on a number of issues. So folks like that, people who are directly impacted by injustice. And teaching them how to basically do radio production and air them on the local radio station. So I think that's just kind of one example, and obviously the IMC here, the model here is just impeccable as far as the nature of the space here is working with peace and justice folks and working with social justice folks, and Danielle and Carol and folks are our community organizers, and they understand how all these issues kind of fit together. So anyway, so the access piece. I think the rights piece is, for us, is about staying vigilant on media policy issues. So closing the digital divide, because we know that the digital divide is still really real. I think the last statistic I heard was like, especially in rural areas, it's really stark. But there's still a good 35% of the population that don't have access to the internet. So staying vigilant on those issues, on internet freedom and net neutrality issues, because that, again, is going to affect how we receive and create media and share it on our mobile phones or on our landline. And then finally, the power. So owning our own media infrastructure, just like Danielle has done amazing work here, and Carol here at the center, and a number of groups, a number of communities where people are starting to own their own media infrastructure. So when we talk about this work, it's like access, rights, and power. And I think that kind of just want to end off by saying that if we're going to thrive, not just survive, but thrive throughout into the future, that's really, really important that these partnerships with folks who are directly impacted and folks who are doing organizing work and social justice work, that it's really, really, really important that we just continue those partnerships and allow them to flourish. So.
Thank you, Betty and Petrie and everyone here. We're running a little bit late, so we've got to wrap this up in a couple of minutes, which is too bad, because I'd really like to open it up to the floor, and I'm afraid if we do that, we'll be here for too long. We'll have some other opportunity to open it up to the floor. I'm hoping that you've got some thoughts about where we might be going, issues that we might be really needing to address. I think there are 3 things that we need to keep in mind in terms of where community radio needs to be focusing. The first is what Petrie brought up. I mean, everyone's been bringing it up, which is the whole question of collaborations. We can't do this in isolation anymore. We can't think of ourselves as being an exception, that as a radio station or as a broadcaster, we're particularly special. We are special, but we're special because we're part of a bigger community. We need to be really plugged in to how to collaborate in our own locality to make our voice as strong as possible. It's exactly what Betty was talking about. Secondly, the whole issue of being able to use the technology and stay on top of that, including policy. We all know the digital landscape is just shifting really quickly. The question of the future of the FCC, the future of regulation, the end of the analog spectrum, the move into the digital spectrum, broadband, more use of the internet, all of those things have a huge impact on us. We need to pay attention to it. We need to really be thinking creatively and empower those of us who actually understand how the technology works to be able to think about how to use it on our behalf and make it continue to make it accessible to us. And the third is sustainability. We've got to stay alive, and we want to be as strong as possible. So how do we do that? How do we pay for what we're doing? How do we make it as participatory as possible and non-exclusive and non-elitist? And how do we make sure that we can actually maintain what we're doing on some kind of a level where we can have strength and power? So those are all our challenges, right? You know, as they say, talk among yourselves. I hope we'll be able to talk among ourselves quite a lot. And on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Danielle for a couple announcements. And we'll all be here. You want to get involved with talking about the future community radio and any of these issues, I'll be the point person. Come and see me, grab me, sit down with me, send me a note, send me an email, whatever. Let me know you're interested, and we'll have a huddle. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Nan Rubin, Petrie Dish, and Betty. Ooh, that was fantastic. If you want to be part of continuing the conversation, you're at the right conference, because this is the opening to a series of conversations. At lunch, Nan and I will be seated at the far corner with a little thing that says Future of Community Radio over our heads. We invite you to be part of that caucus, that kind of task force that will be meeting throughout the weekend to discuss these issues. I wanted to just announce the next session and kind of point you in the right direction. So for those of you who are new to town, I want to help you get where you need to go. And for those of you who are in town, please help our out-of-town guests to get to the places they need to go. The Get On Air Clinic is a clinic run by the Prometheus Radio Project that's specifically for new stations, for groups that want to start LPFMs. And anyone else is certainly welcome to come, especially if you're interested in helping get the word out about LPFM or to help this movement, help these fledgling stations. So having some old timers and some folks who have been with those stations for years, you're certainly welcome to the clinic, and I think your participation would help. The first Get On Air clinic is in the sunroom. The sunroom is the room with the most sun. That's in the back. So it's all the way around the movable walls. We have a session set up there. So all LPFM applicants, please make sure you have a representative. Anyone who wants to start a new station, please make sure you have a representative at that. That's going to be really important for the weekend for you. Second, community engagement will be discussed here on the stage. Third, there is acoustic portraits if you want to learn how to make a portrait with acoustics.
You've been watching or listening to a presentation recorded at the Grassroots Radio Conference 2012 at the Indie Media Center in Urbana, Champaign. Thanks.